Hello, class. Today we're going to talk about the nature of science, and we're going to discuss how scientists have used the scientific method to solve a number of problems that they see on our Earth. The first thing that we need to talk about is the scientific method, which I'm sure you've heard since third grade. But the scientific method is different. You can find different forms of the scientific method wherever you look, and this is just the version that I like to use. The first thing you want to do is you realize there's a question that pops up at you. There's something that surprises you, and you want an answer to it. That could be something like, what environment do pill bugs prefer, or what clothes should I wear today? Or, who should I ask to homecoming? Or something as more scientific like, if I put more pressure in this container, what's going to happen to the volume? So there's a question that pops into your mind and you want an answer for it. So the first step is to identify a question. The next step is to do a little bit of research first, because there's people before you that have done the research, that have done experiments, and they were able to get a conclusion from their work. So sometimes you can save time by doing a little research and gathering information. The next step is then to, once you've done your research and you have a little more knowledge, you form a hypothesis. And as we've learned before, a hypothesis is an educated guess. The term educated comes from the fact that before this step, you've done a little bit of research. After this point, after forming a hypothesis, then you want to gather more information, either through research or, if possible, perform an experiment. So you test your hypothesis to see if you were correct or not. Essentially, then you are going to write down your data from the experiments. You're going to record the data that you find from your experiments, and then you have these questions. What does the data mean? And it's a lot easier to understand meaning from data if you organize the data into charts and graphs or tables. So those help us analyze the data. And finally, we decide, did our data support the hypothesis? Or should we change our hypothesis? Then we make our conclusion. And part of the conclusion is thinking, well, how could I perform this experiment better? Or did I prove my hypothesis correct, or did I disprove my hypothesis? And then finally, you kind of want to think, this is a circle. It's a circle because the scientific method continues. After you have a conclusion, a lot of times a number of other questions pop up. Something surprises you, and you think, okay, what does this mean? And you have another question that pops up, and then you want to answer that question. Another kind of easy way to explain the scientific method is FIOC. Just a quick reminder. P is the problem or the question that pops up. After you have a question, you do some research. The H stands for hypothesis. And usually a hypothesis is stated as an if-then statement. If I increase the pressure on this container, then the volume will increase or decrease. Your experiment is the next part. As the experiment's going on, you'll be observing what's happening, you'll collect your data, you'll put your data into a form that you can analyze, like a chart or a graph, and then you are going to have a conclusion. And then I write down publish in question mark here because very often, if you are professional scientists, when you see something new and when you do an experiment that surprises you, you publish your work so other scientists can see what you've done and draw their own conclusions. There's a number of different parts to an experiment. The first thing to think about is the control. I consider the control the normal conditions. It's kind of like if you want to do an experiment with, testing the fertilizer in a plant. You have fertilizer A, you have fertilizer B, and then you have a third plant with water. That one is your control because water is the normal conditions. The control is also something that we use as sort of a meter stick, a measuring stick, to figure out if, the fertilizer is helping or hurting the plant. Constant, those are the things that are held the same in each trial, and what you'll notice is there are a number of constants, because there should only be one variable. There's one thing you change in an experiment, and everything else should remain the same. If this is done well, then it is a controlled experiment. It's an experiment that is valid. So there are two types of variables. There's the independent variable. It's the thing that I change or modify. What you'll notice here is I've underlined the I's. So when I say independent variable, you should think I change. In the example of the fertilizers I just gave you, that would be the fertilizers. That was the thing I changed. Fertilizer A, fertilizer B, and then the control watered. And I have the word mix written after that, and I'll get back to that later. The next type of variable is the dependent variable. Notice how I underline D. The dependent variable is the data you collect. So when I say dependent variable, you should think data. And I also wrote dry there. I will explain that again in just a little bit. But there are two types of data you can collect. You can collect quantitative data, which is quantity. So quantitative, quantity, think numbers. Okay. Qualitative is the quality, how good something is. These are the describing words, such as if I was doing this plant experiment with the fertilizers, the quantitative data might be something like, the plant grew this tall, grew a certain centimeters tall. If it was qualitative data, it'd be something like the plant was very green, or it looked fresher than the other plants, or there was less water in the soil. Anything like that would be qualitative data, whereas measuring numbers would be quantitative. And then the last two things that we could maybe talk about is observation. An observation is something that you collect with your senses. It's a fact about the world around you that you either collect with the sense of smell, sight, sound, touch, or taste. And it can be recorded. It can be put down in a table, either as quantitative or qualitative data. And the next thing to know is an inference. An inference is a guess. It's basically an idea you create when you're collecting the facts. So as you're making observations around you, you can start thinking about inferences. An inference is sort of like that second step. After you make observations, then you can start to infer, either what's going to happen in the future or take guesses about basically what's happening. The only thing I'd really want to point out that I think I skipped was the word constant. If you go back up to the second line, the things held the same in each trial. The example with the fertilizers, I would mention that the same amount of water was used in each trial, the same amount of soil, the same type of soil, except for the fertilizers put in it. The same type of water, type of light, amount of light. He measured these plants at the same time every day. So everything is held the same except for the one variable, which was the type of fertilizer. So back to mixed dry. The reason I think of mixed dry is because it's a really quick way to think about the independent versus dependent variable. The independent, again, so the M would be modify. I would be the independent variable, and X it's found on the X-axis. So think mix. The thing I modify is the independent variable, and it's on the X-axis. And then the next thing to think about is dry. D, dependent variable, which is the results from your experiment or your data, and it's on the Y-axis. It's just a quick, easy way to remember what axis should have which variable on it. So if I say that you're going to be putting the dependent variable down on a graph, you should understand that that would be on the y-axis. Independent would be on the x. Alright, this is just a quick example of an experiment. Lulu wants to see if the temperature of nitrogen gas makes a difference on the pressure. She puts 50 milliliters of gas into 3 separate liter containers that are connected to a pressure gauge. She then heats the containers. One container will be negative 30 degrees Celsius, one will be 25 degrees Celsius, and the third container will be 60 degrees Celsius. She will record the pressures of each. So basically what she's doing, she's put a certain volume of gas into each container, alright, and she's going to change the temperature. And she's going to see when she changes the temperature what happens to the pressure. So what is the control? Well, the control is the normal conditions. 25 degrees Celsius is about 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That would be about normal room temperature, unless we're at the high school and it's about 85. All right, so the next thing to understand is the constants. What was held the same? Well, she put the same volume in each container, 50 milliliters. She used the same pressure gauge, and she used the same temperature probe in each one. So there were a number of things she held the same, including the container. She also used the same containers to hold the volume, hold the nitrogen gas. So control constant, variable. So now we wonder, what was the independent variable? What was the thing that she changed? Independent, I change. Lulu changed the temperature. And the dependent variable, what was the data she collected? The pressure. So, do you think this would be quantitative or qualitative data? Again, remember, quantitative, quantity, numbers, qualitative, quality, describing words. So yes, quantitative would be the correct answer. A little bit to know about data tables. They should be neat and they should have labeled units. This is just one example of a data table. Notice this data table is qualitative data. We're talking about, is there a reaction? If there's a reaction, what does the precipitate look like? What colors do you see? This is qualitative information, but notice that we've got the labels and it's a very neat table. If we would be using number data, quantitative number data, then we would see something like centimeters up here as the labeled units. Graphs. All right, and graphs are another important thing. This is part of the data you're collecting during your experiment. You should have a descriptive title. For example, they're talking about the dependence of traffic ticket cost on automobile speed. So, cars, the faster they move, the more expensive their speeding ticket. The faster they move, the more expensive their speeding ticket. This title tells us everything we need to know. You can see the independent variable, the thing that you change, is on the x-axis, the speed of the automobile. The dependent variable is the cost of the speeding tickets in dollars. And that's on the y-axis. You can see these axes are labeled not only with a descriptor, but with a unit label. Dollars and kilometers per hour. And the last thing I'd point out about this graph is it is a line of best fit graph. It's a graph that, as you can see, we don't connect the dots, but what we do is we try to hit as many dots or get as close to the data points as possible when drawing our line. And so we're showing an upward trend. This type of trend is called a direct relationship. You can see right here both sets of data go up together or they go down together. The example we saw before was as the speed of the car increases, the price of the ticket also increases. But there's also something called indirect relationships. One set of data goes up, the other goes down. An example of this would be, for example, the more costly something is, the less people want to spend. The less people are going to buy it. So if we have really high prices of something, if something costs a lot of money, there's not a lot of people that want to buy it. But as it decreases in price, there are more and more people willing to purchase that. And the last thing to really mention is a hypothesis, a theory, and a law. A hypothesis, like I mentioned before, is an educated guess. It's a prediction of the reasoning why something's happening. It gives an explanation, but it's an educated explanation because some research has been done. A law is a very strong something. It's a statement that happens across the universe. It's saying this always happens. It states that something happens. It consistently happens everywhere you go in the universe or on Earth. This is going to happen. When you drop something, it will fall to the center of the Earth. And sometimes mathematical equations are involved in this. And finally, a theory. A theory is something, it explains why something happens. It's a little bit more flexible. It's supported by evidence. It hasn't been disproven yet, but it can be altered as new evidence arises. So a law tells us that something happens. A theory tries to explain why something happens. So it can be a little bit more flexible there.